A Boeing Century of the Royal Air Force is on patrol over the North Sea. It's there to provide an early warning of any intruders. 8 hours into the mission, 2 intruders are picked up on the radar screen. Identified as Russian surveillance aircraft, they're heading for NATO ships taking part in an exercise below. F-16s based in Norway are fog-bound, so the Sentry calls in 2 Tornado F-3s from RAF Coningsby to intercept and turn away the uninvited visitors. Airspace has become the battlefield where wars are won or lost. During the course of the 20th century, battlefields changed dramatically. Tanks, artillery, and automatic weapons revolutionized warfare. But it is the aeroplane that has created the biggest change of all. This is because the aeroplane can go virtually anywhere, unrestrained by sea or land, at any time, very quickly. It can fire weapons of unparalleled ferocity and accuracy, and it gives commanders the perspective of the battlefield only achieved by height.
10 seconds. Roger, looking good. Flash. Oh dear, that went up. Yeehaw.
Whatever form of conflict or humanitarian operations we find ourselves involved in, one of the sine qua non, one of the things that we absolutely must have is the ability to control the skies, because that is an enabling characteristic. If we can control the skies, then everything else is possible. If we can't control the skies, then nothing else is probably going to be possible.
The Royal Air Force has been central to the evolution of air power and the technologies that have made the aeroplane the decisive weapon of the 20th century. It is also the oldest independent air force in the world, with origins that take it back to the earliest days of powered flight. At the turn of the century, the Royal Navy protected Britain's vast empire with the largest, most modern fleet in the world. The Army was a well-equipped professional force. Machine guns and artillery had increased its killing power. The train had given it new speed and mobility. But once away from the railhead, the Army still trudged on foot, or at best traveled at a horse's pace. Mobility enabled the Army to outmaneuver an enemy. But this was only possible if a commander knew exactly where the enemy forces were and where they were likely to move. The Duke of Wellington put it best when he said,
"I've spent all my life in trying to guess what was on the other side of the hill."
So by the beginning of the 20th century, the battlefield was still defined by the ability of the opposing forces to actually see each other. Any reconnaissance was carried out on horseback. Tethered balloons filled with gas or hot air provided a better view, but they were at the mercy of the wind. Experiments in heavier-than-air flight only seemed to confirm that its military potential would at best be very limited. Then, one windy morning in 1903, in Kitty Hawk, North Carolina, 2 brothers, Orville and Wilbur Wright, changed everything forever. They flew in a machine they called the Flyer. With its small, light petrol engine and a system of movable surfaces, they didn't just fly the Flyer, they controlled its flight. Their success galvanized everyone. In 1906, a Brazilian, Alberto Santos Dumont, won 3,000 francs for being the first person to fly in Europe. The total distance of his flight, 122 meters. In 1907, Henry Farman, the English-born Paris correspondent of the London Standard, flew his machine for a whole minute. By 1908, the Wright brothers had already achieved flights of up to 24 miles, and they spent a year in Europe giving flying demonstrations in an attempt to sell their patents. Some of these flights were made with passengers and lasted over 2 hours. The Wrights claimed that aircraft would make war impossible. But how could these flimsy flying devices serve any practical use in war? British military minds were skeptical. It was pioneers like flamboyant American showman Samuel F. Cody who led the way. Cody had developed man-carrying kites and taught kiting to the British Army. But his real interest was in powered flight. In 1908, he made his first flight in an aircraft called the Cathedral. He failed to convince senior officers, and the following year his funding was cut off. Although the War Office had already spent £2,500 on aircraft experiments, it had decided that airships offered more scope for reconnaissance. The Royal Navy agreed. They argued that the English Channel was too wide to cross by air. So from a defense point of view, who needed an air force? Especially when they had a navy. Then in July 1909, Louis Blériot blew away this argument by flying straight across the English Channel. On the following day, a journalist wrote,
When Mr. Farman flew a mile, it was possible to say that an ingenious toy had been invented. But a machine which can fly from Calais to Dover is not a toy, but an instrument of warfare, of which soldiers and statesmen must take account.
In the following month, around 500,000 people saw Europe's aviators competing at the first great flying meeting held at Reims in France. The golden age of flying had truly begun. Among the aircraft on show were monoplanes built by Blériot. Typical of most aircraft of the period, they were made of wood, canvas and wire, and flew at around 45 miles per hour. Controls were basic. A simple control column flexed the wing, and the rudder was moved by the foot pedals. Perilously fragile, Blériot's machine was nevertheless very successful and would equip Britain's Royal Flying Corps at the beginning of the First World War. The first Englishman to fly was A.V. Roe, who pioneered triplane designs. Speed, altitude and endurance improved rapidly, although aircraft controls were still no more than basic. With no navigation instruments of any kind, pilots often made their way by using landmarks on the ground. Often they followed railway lines, called Bradshawing after the railway timetables of the period. And with the pilots completely exposed to the elements, warm, heavy clothing was imperative, which meant the aircraft could only just carry the pilot and had little or no lift to spare for bombs or guns. Even so, the War Office and Admiralty agreed to provide airfield facilities, but only if private individuals supplied the aircraft. Meanwhile, other countries were building air services. Since 1900, the Germans had been developing giant airships called Zeppelins. Although they were often used to fly civilians over great distances, they were also equipping the armed forces. The airship was seen as the main threat to Britain's ports and harbours, and a report by the Home Ports Defence Committee concluded that their best form of defence against airships would be the much more agile aircraft. On April the 1st, 1911, the Air Battalion, Royal Engineers, was formed. It was just 190 strong. Prospective pilots had to be officers with some previous experience of aeronautics, language skills, and sailing experience. And they had to pay for their own flying lessons. When they had their certificate, the Army gave them £75, but this came nowhere near the actual cost. Only the rich could afford to learn to fly, thus creating the impression that pilots were an elite. But already their flying demonstrations were captivating the next generation of pilots.
In Sheffield, where I live, they had the Sheffield Independent Aviation Week. And I can't remember the date, but it was very early. And the person who came, it was only one aircraft, Harold Blackburn, and the Blackburn monoplane. And so we got excited about it at home. My father was very interested in airplanes. And my sister, Clara, Mrs. Ward, she took me as a boy, and I was too young to go on my own to see Blackburn fly. And my word, it was quite nice. I'd only seen one aircraft in the air, and what I knew about it was from the aeroplane, book magazine, and photographs in newspapers, odd ones. And so it was quite wonderful to see him go with this monoplane up twice and do 2 little circles round the chimney tops.
It was only much later, and after severe losses in France in 1916, that other ranks were able to find their way into the pilot's seat. In 1911, the French had over 100 aircraft supporting their ground forces, with more on order. Germany had 30 pilots and 37 military aircraft, and they were training for war. By comparison, Britain's service was in a sorry state. The Army had only 11 qualified airmen, the Navy 8. And for equipment, all they had was a motley selection of aircraft and 2 worn-out experimental airships. Something had to be done.
Aviation at the time was perhaps more dependent than people have often realized, more dependent on ancillary technologies than might otherwise have been the case. It's one thing to take some lengths of timber, wire, fabric, and build an airframe, but into that airframe you have to install an engine which has its own technology, its own evolution. It has dependency on the chemistry of its fuels and its lubricants. It depends on the metallurgy of the steels and the white metals and so on from which it's made. And all of these things had to be brought together at a time when nobody really knew what they were doing all that well in any of these different technologies. So it was a jolly difficult situation.
And so in April 1912, the aviation sections of the Army and Navy were merged into one organization called the Royal Flying Corps. Its first commander was Major Frederick Sykes, who spent the next 2 years building up the RFC. New designs, like the French-built Caudron, were ordered as reconnaissance aircraft, a role Sykes was convinced the other services would find useful. Shortly after this, the Avro 504 came into service. The 504 would see service in many roles, including training, well into the 1930s. Meanwhile, the Navy continued to experiment with aviation. but many senior officers said that the aeroplane was useless for the purposes of war. In August 1914, Europe erupted into the First World War. Volunteers flocked to join up as Britain prepared to confront Germany. 6 squadrons of the RFC, 860 personnel and 45 aeroplanes left for France, although nobody really knew what they would do when they got there.
So the RFC didn't go into the field completely blind, but of course there was absolutely no preparation, no sheds, no maintenance facilities, no services, I don't suppose. The country fields in the north of France in 1914 didn't have running water laid on. Life must have been extremely difficult for the RFC, especially in those first few weeks of the war, when the war itself was a war of movement, and the RFC had to be constantly on the move to keep pace with where the army was, because its duty was first and foremost to the army. So they had their problems, and durability of these aircraft, probably with no hangarage of any kind, in the first few weeks were almost insurmountable.
The German strategy was based on a plan devised by General Alfred von Schlieffen. Mobility was his key, and the plan was to sweep into France through Belgium and go straight for Paris. From here, the German army would be put on trains and moved across Europe to concentrate on a war against Russia, who would take longer to mobilize. The fighting was bitter, but the German attacks went well, and within weeks they were approaching Paris. Then, on the 6th of September, RFC reconnaissance aircraft observed the German army changing direction and moving to the north of Paris across the face of the French lines. Acting on this information, the Allies moved to attack the German flank. The Germans were forced to retreat to defensive positions, and the French capital was saved.
Well, I think what air power achieved in 1914 was to destroy the Army's strategic surprise. For the first time, the plan that the Germans had to invade into France was going to be detected and therefore countered by an aircraft that was reconnoitering the area. In fact, Georges said, based on a report from the aircraft, today we fight on the Marne. So that destroyed the enemy's ability now to achieve strategic surprise. We were always going to know what he was likely to achieve or what directions he was likely to achieve. And arguably that therefore forced a form of stalemate that was going to result in trench warfare, because now the idea of a rapid breakthrough was going to be detected and therefore countered.
For the first time, the aeroplane had played a key part in changing the face of war. With the advantage of surprise lost, the only alternative was to start a war of attrition. The war was supposed to be over by Christmas. Instead, there was muddy deadlock with both sides facing each other in trenches across a winter wasteland. Boredom, cold, mud, and mass slaughter became the norm as two huge armies battled this way and that for a few yards of ground. Artillery, supported by aircraft acting as spotters, had become one of the most lethal weapons on the battlefield.
Well, from the strategic reconnaissance, one now saw the utility of aircraft in spotting for artillery. And artillery, instead of being used as they had been through the Napoleonic campaigns and all previous campaigns in a direct fire mode, now for the first time could be fired against targets on the far side of the hill, and aircraft could pass corrections for the fall of shot.
But it was a time-consuming process, with the pilot having to land in order to deliver his report. The arrival of wireless telegraphy speeded the process up considerably. Aerial photography was also used, often revealing the massing of troops, which indicated that a major attack was brewing. Aerial reconnaissance was becoming essential, but soon it became obvious that to prevent the other side from getting back home with the information, aerial attack was called for. For the first time, domination of the sky assumed military importance. In the early weeks of the war, pilots had often waved at each other as they passed. Now, they began to shoot.
There were one or two combats flown not specifically by a great man called Norman Spratt, who had been a pre-war pilot at Hendon, and he made one or two attempts to bring German aircraft to battle, as it were, but armament was ineffective, and in one or two of these occasions all he had was a pistol, simple handgun, though on another occasion he had fought with the German aircraft without doing any damage visibly, and he came down rather cross and devised a primitive weapon of a length of control cable with a hand grenade at the other end of it. And he went off intent on trying to fly above the enemy aircraft and entangle this dreadful weapon in the enemy airplane's propeller. Of course, he didn't succeed, but the thought was there, and the spirit was willing. And I really think that perhaps Norman Spratt, more than any man, has the right to be regarded as the world's first single-seat fighter pilot.
A fast-moving aircraft was very difficult to hit. Then, Roland Garros, a French aviator, used a fixed machine gun which fired forwards through the propeller, which was fitted with metal plates to deflect any bullets which struck it. He downed 5 German aircraft before being shot down himself and captured. Anthony Fokker, a Dutchman working for the German Air Service, improved on Garrot's design. He created an interrupter gear which only allowed the gun to fire in the split seconds when the propeller was out of the way. Now the stage was set for the development of the world's first aerial killing machine. The Fokker Eindecker was just that. It was lethal, it was light and maneuverable, and all the pilot had to do was point his plane at the enemy and press the trigger. British reconnaissance aircraft like the BE-2, which was very stable in flight but slow to maneuver, was defenseless against the Eindecker. It became known as Fokker fodder. The Eindecker scourge of 1915 had begun.
These aircraft suffered from their stability, which was their raison d'etre in the first place. If they were brought to combat by a more maneuverable airplane, such as the Fokker monoplane, the BE-2C had the greatest difficulty in defending itself and getting away. In the first place, it was generally slower than the Fokker, and its armament, such as it was ineffectively installed, was generally fired by the observer alone, and he was in the front cockpit, surrounded by struts, wires, engine and propeller in front of him, and pilot behind him, and it's not a good idea to shoot the pilot, especially if you're the observer in the front seat with no flying controls. So he had a very limited field of fire.
The Germans, flying in large formations, had won control of the air. Unable to supply an effective interrupter mechanism, British manufacturers reverted to an old idea, the pusher, which allowed the observer at the front an unobstructed field of fire. These gun buses first flew over the battlefield in February 1916 and helped to end the reign of the Eindecker.
The pusher could give a man in the cockpit, whether he was the pilot or an observer, a very clear forward field of fire, but it had a great penalty imposed on it. With so much structure, there was a lot of drag, and it was therefore slower.
In July 1916, the Allies attacked on the Somme. As the months of slaughter progressed, the Royal Flying Corps struggled to keep up with an ever-increasing number and range of missions. Inferior aircraft wasn't their only problem. They also had too many different types of aircraft. Major General Hugh Trenchard, commanding the Royal Flying Corps in France, believed that the RFC should do all it could to support the Allied offensives. He had insisted on continuing the aerial offensive even after the Fokker Scourge had drained his force. But he was also fighting enemies at home who wanted to withhold investment.
You are asking me to fight the battle this year with the same machines as I fought it last year. We shall be hopelessly outclassed, and something must be done.
The RFC had favored designs from the Royal Aircraft Factory at the expense of independent manufacturers. To protect their interests, the independents grouped together in a move which would soon produce new and better aircraft to equip the squadrons. But not quite soon enough. Bloody April 1917 was the low point for the Royal Flying Corps. In that 1 month, 316 men died while flying in support of a big ground offensive at Arras.
Their worst hour came early in 1917 when the Type and its variants, the 2D and the 2E, had been kept in production far too long, far beyond the final point of viability of the Type.
Still equipped with obsolete aircraft like the BE-2, they came up against the might of the Jaster, wings formed by the German Air Service specifically to put as many aircraft as possible into the air at one time. Somehow, the RFC survived and was soon fighting back with new aircraft. 3 Types delivered in 1917 were some of the best aircraft of the war. The SC-5A was undoubtedly the best aircraft to come out of the Royal Aircraft Factory and was popular with pilots because it was stable, which made it a good gun platform. The Bristol F-2B was one of the longest-serving aircraft in the history of the RFC and later the RAF. It was unusual in being a 2-seat fighter with 2 machine guns, one firing forward and another for the observer. It was so successful that the Germans began avoiding combat with the Bristol fighters. Eventually, it was the first fighter to equip all the fighter and reconnaissance squadrons. But possibly the most famous of the 3 new types was the Sopwith Camel.
The Camel was flying by Christmas 1916, and it was a great step forward in the RFC because it was the first British fighter to have twin synchronized Vickers guns firing forward through the propeller.
Small, tough, but immensely maneuverable, it was fitted with a ferocious rotary engine that could be the downfall of an unsuspecting pilot. In unpracticed hands, it could snap into a spin, leaving the pilot, in the words of one veteran, with 3 choices: Red Cross, Victoria Cross, or Wooden Cross. In experienced hands, though, the Camel was the greatest dogfighter of the war and shot down more enemy aircraft than any other Allied fighter. In its heyday, it was unmatched by any German fighter save one, the Fokker triplane. The battle for air supremacy began again.
The RFC, and later the RAF, pursued an essentially aggressive war. Trenchard was very keen on maintaining the offensive against the enemy at all costs. And this meant that our aircraft were over German-held territory to a far greater extent than German aircraft ever crossed over Allied territory. This meant that the German fighter pilots had a far bigger supply of potential targets than Allied fighter pilots did. And our offensive patrols had to reach out over enemy territory just as much as the bombers did.
Vast packs of highly maneuverable fighters would confront each other before breaking to engage in individual combat. They learned the hard way that the best way to attack was from above and with the sun behind them. In 1916, the first manual of air fighting appeared. It began by describing the nature of both British and German pilots.
The British pilot likes the idea of fighting. He's a quick thinker compared with the enemy. He has the advantage in maneuver. The enemy pilot is of a gregarious nature from long national training bound by strict rules. The enemy pilots are often uneducated men, simply drivers of the machine. The gunner or observer is considered a grade higher than the pilot.
This was good for RFC morale, but it was training in targeting, positioning and firing that were to have the greatest effect on aerial combat. Pilots were advised to fire from 50 yards and to aim at the pilot of the enemy aircraft because
Machines go up every day and return absolutely under control, but having dozens or even hundreds of holes in different places.
But fighting could be very disorientating, with pilots relying on their quick reactions and instincts.
Aircraft attacking him from all directions, and then all of a sudden he finds himself in a clear sky with not an aircraft in sight, no British aircraft, no French, no German, they'd all gone somewhere. And it happened just as fast as that.
This was the era of the ace. Pilots with 5 or more kills to their credit were seized upon by the generals and press to provide some kind of glamour in an ever more depressing war. These battles in the clear blue sky seemed noble and clean, sharp contrast to the mud and stench of trench warfare. Men such as Mick Mannock, Albert Ball, and James McCudden were looked upon as heroes, legends that would inspire future generations of pilots. Even German aces like Oswald Boelcke and Max Immermann were regarded with awe. But the most famous and most deadly of them all was Manfred von Richthofen, the Red Baron, who in his blood-red Fokker triplane accounted for so many RFC pilots. When he died, the Allies buried him with full military honors. His death showed that aces were just as vulnerable as all the other pilots who daily risked their lives and died, soon forgotten, after they had spiraled on fire into the mud below. By 1917, the Germans held most of the industrial north of France. They knew that the French and their British allies would stop at nothing to shift them. New weapons were needed. The tank looked like a solution. Tanks had first been used in 1916 and caused turmoil in the German lines. Within months, they were an essential part of any attack, providing infantry with valuable support.
Well, given that air superiority was successful and you now had the opportunity to prosecute other forms of warfare, the Army realized very quickly that there were a number of other things you could do with the aircraft. And the first of those was carrying the war to a greater depth than you previously had from your own artillery pieces. Secondly, of course, you could use the aircraft to attack trenches directly. And a number of attacks were carried out where aircraft strafed troops in the trenches, demoralized them, and that therefore opened the path then for a subsequent land offensive. But perhaps the greatest advantage was where the aircraft was used in synergy with the tank. The tank itself became very, very vulnerable to attack by artillery in direct fire mode. And the way in which the aircraft was used, therefore, to destroy the enemy's artillery allowed the tank to achieve its full potential and to exploit the enemy weaknesses.
Attacking targets of tactical importance to the Army, such as artillery, trenches and railways, had been the main role of the RFC since the earliest days of the war. Aircrews had experimented with bombs slung under their aircraft, but with no sighting mechanism, the few bombs that hit their targets were too small to cause serious damage. However, it was the Royal Naval Air Service who pioneered long-range bombing to counter the threat of the Zeppelin airships. Germany had seen the potential of aerial bombardment long before the war, and had designed Zeppelins specifically to act as bombers. The bombs first began to fall on England in 1914. Their targets were factories vital to the war effort, but they were often bombing at night and from high altitude. Inevitably, their bombs missed, causing damage and death among civilians. Zeppelin attacks went on for 3 years, with what the man in the street saw as attacks on ordinary men, women and children. There was a public outcry, as Germany seemed to be able to strike at the heart of the British Empire with impunity. To calm fears, anti-aircraft guns were sighted around vulnerable factories, and squadrons were brought back from France to try and provide some aerial defense. Gradually, they began to take a heavy toll of the ponderous airships. The RNAS had realized early in the war that aerial bombardment could extend the ability of the Royal Navy to hit strategic targets. And seeing Zeppelins as a threat to their ships and ports, had, as early as 1914, attacked the Zeppelin factory at Friedrichshafen. They only caused slight damage, but the effect was dramatic. 4,000 men and anti-aircraft batteries were hastily removed from the Western Front and sent to defend the factory. The RNAS were eager to continue the bombing of strategic targets, and the Admiralty asked Handley Page to build a bloody paralyzer that would stop the Germans in their tracks. The result was the Handley Page 0100, which was gigantic. Its wingspan was 114 feet, and its powerful twin 250 horsepower engines meant that it could carry nearly 1,800 pounds of bombs. But the plans to launch a strategic bombing campaign were scrapped. At the same time, the RFC, still doubtful about the value of long-range bombing, were adapting aircraft to carry small bomb loads to support the ground forces. However, the resulting lack of maneuverability and armament made them vulnerable to the German fighters. An exception was the DH-4, which did provide crews with some defense, but as a result, it carried fewer bombs. Then, in 1917, the Germans bombed London, using an aircraft flying from France. German air raids on London continued throughout the summer. Their Gotha bomber could carry just over 1,000 pounds of bombs, not an immense payload, but their attacks were so frequent and the defenses so inadequate that a new public outcry ensued. Parliament acted swiftly, asking the eminent South African statesman, General Jan Smuts, to report. He recommended the setting up of a strengthened, unified air force for home defense. He caused uproar when he suggested that
the day may not be far off when aerial operations, with their devastation of enemy lands and destruction of industrial and populous centers on a vast scale, may become the principal operations of war, to which the older forms of military and naval operations may become secondary and subordinate.
Even officers of the RFC and RNAS, including Trenchard, disagreed, not with the proposal itself, but with the idea that it should be carried out in the middle of a war. Parliament, however, did agree. And on April the 1st, 1918, the Royal Air Force was founded, the first air service in the world that was independent of Army or Navy.
You're all in now, en bloc, whether you like it or not. You're in the Royal Air Force, but you're not actually in it yet, properly, because you're going to be in, and this is most important, at a day to be fixed. Remember this, he said, a date to be fixed. But you're in the Royal Air Force now, and you'll have to forget your Royal Flying Corps as much as you can. Talk Royal Air Force.
At the same time, the independent force was created to start a bombing offensive against the heartland of Germany on a more massive scale than ever before. Handley Page 0100s, the first of the bloody paralyzers originally commissioned by the Admiralty, formed the basis of the new force. In the spring of 1918, the 0100s were augmented by the even larger 0400s, which could carry the new 1,800-pound bombs.
A night bombing must have been a very hairy exercise in those days, because there were really no aids to night flying worth talking about. Cockpits were fitted up with funny little P-bulbs, electric P-bulbs that illuminated individual instruments. There were no navigational aids worth talking about. It was very much a case of by guess and by God and pray for fine weather.
Specifications for even more powerful aircraft were issued, the outcome of which was the Vickers Vimy. Arguably the best of the heavies, the Vimy was delivered just too late to see wartime service. It was smaller than the HPO 400, but could carry a bomb load of 2,500 pounds and carry it faster and further. At the time of the armistice in November 1918, plans already existed for Vimys to fly 1,000 miles on the round trip from Britain to Berlin. The aircraft would become the standard heavy bomber after the war, and it stayed in service on second-line duties until the 1930s. By the summer of 1918, the new Royal Air Force, with more than 20,000 aircraft in service, was the world's strongest air force. Improved supply and design had provided the quality so badly lacking in the early years, and better training was turning out well-qualified pilots. But now, the war in Europe was taking a new course. The sinking of the Lusitania by a German U-boat brought the Americans into the war on the side of the Allies. Their airmen were flying British and French airframes, but they had powerful Liberty engines which transformed the DH-9.
A point had been reached where the Americans wanted to use our DH-9A, and by some local arrangements, I don't know how much liquor changed hands in the negotiations, but an agreement was reached, entirely unofficially, that the Americans would deliver two Liberty engines to their British counterparts in France, and they would then get one of the Liberties back with a DH-9A airframe attached to it. So they got their DH-9As, complete with Liberty, and we got an extra Liberty. I don't know what that did to the official statistics, but it must have helped things along a bit at the time.
The Russian Revolution in 1917 had led to the collapse of the Russian army, allowing the Germans to move troops from Russia to the Western Front. In the spring of 1918, the Germans mounted their biggest attack of the war. The RAF found itself in the thick of the fighting, flying combat patrols, bombing and reconnaissance missions day and night. On one day alone, they shot down 49 enemy aircraft and 6 observation balloons. The German attacks finally ground to a halt in July 1918, and the Allies launched the final offensive of the war. As the exhausted German forces retreated, the RAF found their targets out in the open rather than in deep trenches. They bombed airfields, bridges, roads and communications. Troops were strafed and German aircraft were shot out of the skies. The end of the war was near. On November the 11th, 1918, the armistice was signed. The RAF had finally won the air war, but at a cost. Losses in one squadron alone, number 80, were appallingly high. In the last 10 months of the war, 168 officers were either killed or wounded. In 4 years of war, more than 9,000 men of the RFC, RNAS, and RAF had died. But the RAF, a service of barely 8 months standing, had won the battle for the skies. In the end, quantity had been one of the decisive factors. The Allies had had more than 9,000 aircraft, the Germans fewer than 2,500. Although the quality of aircraft was fairly equal, the quality of pilots weighed heavily in favor of the Allies. For most of the war, Britain had followed a policy of rotating pilots between operational and training squadrons, giving them the opportunity to rest and give new recruits the benefit of their experience. Many of the German pilots had fought continuously for months on end. Exhaustion had taken its toll of the old hands, and their replacements just didn't have the experience. Air power came of age in the First World War. Barely 15 years after the Wright brothers had flown at Kitty Hawk, the aeroplane had changed the face of war forever. 10 years before, the world had watched in astonishment as Blériot flew the Channel. Now, the Vimy could fly 1,000 miles from London to Berlin and back, taking a full payload of bombs on the outward journey. No one knew what would come next, where aviation would go. But it was clear that the future of Britain's air defences lay with the RAF.
The Hanley Page 0400 was a giant aeroplane with a wingspan of 100 feet and a length of nearly 63 feet. It was the only Allied bomber of the First World War to drop the enormous 1,650-pound bomb in night raids on Germany. After the war, 0400s were converted for use in the fledgling passenger and freight commercial airlines. The Avro 504 was one of the longest-serving aircraft in the RAF's history. The first marks, dating from 1913, were used as bombers and reconnaissance aircraft. Later variants, including this 504K, were widely used as trainers until the 1930s. Made of wood and fabric and fitted with a variety of engines, over 8,000 504s were built in a 20-year period of production. The famous School of Special Flying at Gosport used 504s and developed the basics of flying instruction that stayed with the RAF for many years. After service life, many of these classic aircraft went into private hands and became the perfect aircraft for joyriding and charter work that introduced so many members of the public to aviation between the wars. The Avro Anson, or Faithful Annie as it was affectionately known, was built in thousands for Coastal Command during the late 1930s. Although it was used as a bomber in the early stages of the Second World War, it was just too slow, with a top speed of 188 miles an hour and too lightly armed for prolonged use. However, it soon became the standard trainer for many of the pilots who would go on to fly bombers later in the war. Over 11,000 were built, and the last example didn't join the RAF until 1952. The Bolton Paul Balliol was a two-seat piston-engine trainer used by the RAF from 1952 to 1957. 145 were built for the RAF, powered by the Merlin 35 engine, but their service life was cut short by the introduction of jet trainers as replacements. The BE-2C was the standard light bomber of the RFC during the middle years of the First World War. Although a stable platform for bombing, it was vulnerable to fighters and ground fire due to its low speed and lack of maneuverability, and consequently suffered heavy losses. It had a top speed of 90 miles an hour and could carry 224 pounds of bombs. Over 1,500 were built. The Bristol Beaufort was Coastal Command's standard torpedo bomber until 1943 and was also used in a variety of other bombing and mine-laying roles. But it was a heavy and underpowered aircraft that suffered heavy losses while flying low-level attacks on German shipping. The Beaufort carried one 1,605-pound torpedo or up to 2,000 pounds of bombs and had a top speed of 260 miles an hour. After torpedo-carrying Beaufighters began to replace the Beauforts, they were used in the Far East and Middle East. The Short Belfast was the largest and heaviest aircraft in the RAF when it entered service in 1966. Although only 10 examples flew with the RAF, they clocked up many millions of miles as long-range freighters, delivering stores and troops all over the world. This mobile block of flats, as one pilot described the Belfast, could carry 80,000 pounds of freight or 150 fully kitted troops. The Blackburn Beverley was a cavernous transport aircraft which served with the RAF from 1956 to 1968. Its rear-loading doors, at that time unique in the RAF, gave easy access for a variety of loads. Although it was cumbersome in appearance, the Beverley had a remarkable short takeoff and landing ability which made it ideal for desert and jungle work in the Middle and Far East. 47 were built for the RAF and gave 12 years trouble-free service. The Bristol Blenheim was one of the first new aircraft to enter service with the RAF in the years of modernisation before the Second World War. The Mark I proved to be virtually obsolete before the war began, and the Mark IV quickly replaced it. This famous long-nosed Blenheim would become the standard light bomber of the RAF for the first 2 years of the war. However, with a top speed of only 266 miles an hour and relatively light defensive armament, Blenheim suffered heavy losses against the Luftwaffe in the early raids and during the Battle for France in 1940. Blenheims fared better when ranged against the Italian Air Force, undertaking low-level raids from Egypt and Malta against airfields and naval targets. Blenheims were also used as home defense night fighters until the introduction of the Beaufighter, and proved to be very worthy stopgap aircraft in coastal command, attacking German shipping in the English Channel and the North Sea. The Douglas Boston was a twin-engined light bomber built in America for the RAF. Entering service early in 1942, it could carry double the bomb load of the Blenheim if replaced, and had a top speed of 304 miles an hour. Bostons played a significant role in the North African campaign and gave sterling service on daylight raids over Europe prior to the Normandy invasion. On D-Day itself, they laid smoke screens to protect the invasion forces. The Bristol fighter was one of a handful of great British fighters of the First World War, along with the Sopwith Camel and the SE-5A. The Bristol fighter entered service in 1917 and was something of an oddity, being a two-seater in a world dominated by fierce little single-seaters. But such was the success of this aircraft, with both forward and backward-firing machine guns, that German aircraft positively shied away from combat. Over 5,000 were built, mainly with Rolls-Royce Falcon engines, giving a top speed of 126 miles an hour. Unlike many of its contemporaries, the Bristol fighter stayed in service long after the war, becoming an important part of the Empire policing forces in India and the Middle East until 1932.